Hi, this is Adam from Icebreaker Audio here to give you a detailed walk through the Grid 2 instrument. When developing Grid 2, I wanted to create an instrument that could produce a wide range of sounds, but with a relatively simple control set. I also wanted to create an instrument that would encourage experimentation. The outcome of this is that I produced an instrument that I think you collaborate with rather than use like a tool. So the instrument itself will influence your music as much as you do. The namesake of the grid instrument is this 8x8 grid sequencer. Along the x-axis we have the steps in the sequence, and along the y-axis we have the voices. Now you can think of voices as partials in an additive synthesizer or as notes in a scale. In truth, it lies somewhere between the two in this grey area, depending how you use the instrument. Beside the grid sequencer, there's the mixer, which allows you to control the volume for each of the voices. Grid 2 functions in two modes. There's the sequence mode and the played mode. When in sequence mode, the steps play back from the host clock, and when you're in played mode, you can trigger the sounds from MIDI keys. There are over 100 snapshots that utilize both of these modes and that are further categorized by their sound characteristics. For this walkthrough, however, we are going to load an empty snapshot using the init snap from the sequenced bank. So here we have an empty patch that is set to sequenced mode. The first thing I'm going to do is create a very basic linear sequence. So each step in the sequencer is playing back a different voice. And I'm going to play that back so you can hear what a blank patch sounds like. So there we have something that sounds like a sine wave playing notes in a scale. In truth, it's actually playing the frequencies of the harmonic series, but we'll get to that a bit later on. So the first section we're going to look at is the source section. It contains all of the controls that relate to the sound of the voices. We're not going to look at each control individually, but we are going to look at the most important controls and then play around with it and see how each section influences the sound. So for the voices, we have an amplitude envelope, the frequency controls, a pitch envelope, a ring modulator that's per voice, the oscillator shape controls, and feedback controls. So one of the controls that turns up in 3 of the sections is this scale knob. And what the scale knob does is it scales the parameters according to the voice number. So in the case of the amplitude envelope, when we turn the scale knob to a positive value, as the voices increase, the decay time will decrease. When we move it to a negative number, as the voices increase, the decay time will increase. In this case, it usually sounds best at a positive value, as shorter decays for higher frequencies sounds more natural. Another important feature that will heavily influence the sound is the frequency mode. There are 2 modes. There's harmonic mode, which we've already listened to, where the frequencies of the voices is set by the harmonic series. So when it's in its default state like this, the voices go up the harmonic series. If we increase this, then that stretches it out to a factor of 2. When we move it down, all of the voices have the same frequency. The equal knob then moves everything by a pitch value. There's also the melodic mode where you can set the frequencies by scales and tunings. So when we select a scale, each of the voices will be assigned a frequency relative to the notes in the scale. The tuning will then alter the tuning of the scale, so like a temperament. By default, it's an equal temperament, but you can experiment with some other alternative tunings. For this walkthrough, I'm going to pick the Heavyocity scale, which is a Japanese scale, and I'm going to set that to a just temperament. I'm also going to increase the pitch a bit so that it's in a higher range. So let's just have a quick listen to our scale. The next 3 sections are pretty standard. We have a pitch envelope, which is a simple decay envelope that is assigned to the pitch of all of the voices. We have a ring modulator, which can work either in ratio mode, where the frequency of the ring modulator is relative to the frequency of the voice. Or you can set it to fixed mode, where the frequency of the ring modulator is set by a pitch and then is the same for all voices. In the oscillator controls, we have a shape control, which alters the symmetry of the sine wave. So as you turn it up, it becomes more like a saw wave. We also have a brightness control, which you can use to alter the high frequency content of the oscillators. So let's quickly play around with those and alter the sound a little bit. Okay, so now we have a bit more of a complex waveform that we're playing with. We've also got a little bit of a pitch envelope that's making the sound a little bit more percussive in nature. Now I want to talk about the last section separately, which is the feedback section. In the feedback section, what you can do is take the main output of the instrument and route that back into the control inputs for the voices. So you can take the final output and modulate either the frequency using the FM knob or the hard sync using the sync knob. The results can either just change the waveform slightly or can completely alter the sound into something glitchy and very noisy depending how much you dial in. Let's experiment with those a little bit. There we go, we have quite a strange sound coming out of what was originally just a normal scale. So I think I'm going to dial those back because we just want to create a basic melodic sequence, not a weird glitchy sound. Next, we're going to look at the master effects section. There are two main master effects. There's the filter, which is a combination of low pass and high pass filter with an overdrive circuit. And there's a delay, which is a kind of analog style delay, which can either be tempo synced or free running. So rather than talk about these in any great detail, I'm just going to play around with them so you can hear how they sound. So one of the things you may have noticed there is that the feedback knob can actually be turned up over 100%. That creates a kind of infinite feedback loop in the delay. It allows you to create these kind of long, distorted drones within your sound, and it can be quite cool. You don't have to use it, but I find it to be quite fun sometimes. Also, the fact that the delay is used kind of like a send, where you can control the input. So you can send a sound into the delay, turn the feedback the whole way up, and then bring the input down. And the feedback will keep on going even though you're not pushing sound into the delays. The third section in the effect tab is the output section. And you'll notice at the top there's these two knobs, the dry knob and the wet knob. What Grid 2 allows you to do is take any of the voices and have it bypass the master effects. So in this case, we can take every other voice, activate the bypass, and then they will bypass the filter and delay and go straight into this dry knob. Any of the voices that go through the master effects will come into the wet knob, and then these will control the volume outputs of each. So with each other voice bypassed, let's just listen to adjusting the volumes of these two things. Then we have a width knob, which controls the panning of the voices. As you turn that up, the voices become more and more panned, left-right alternating. The lowest voice will always be dead in the center, and then the panning will increase as the voices increase. There's also a leveling knob, which controls a compressor, which If you're using a more percussive sound, it will make it a little bit more punchy. If it's a softer sound, you can use it just to control the output volume a little. And then there's a soft clip button, which applies a clipping limiter to the very end of the instrument. Sometimes whenever you have a lot of modulation going on or weird settings, you can get a bit of short clipping. So this will just control that a bit better and make it sound nicer than a digital clip that you'd get normally. Next, we'll look at the modulation section. There are 4 modulation sources, 2 LFOs and 2 modulation sequences. You can edit the modulation sequences by clicking the Mod tab up here beside the grid sequencer. So here you can see the modulation sequence, which you can just draw in by clicking and dragging. One of the things that I like to do with the modulation sequences is set them up as a kind of gate. So the value is either off or on. Set up 2 of those like this. And then assign one of them to the delay send and one of them to the delay feedback. Turn them up full. And then turn these down all the way. And we'll set that to 64th notes. So what this does is whenever we reach these steps in the modulation sequence, we will turn the send all the way up and turn the feedback all the way up. And then you'll get this jitter for a short time. Then they'll be turned all the way down and the delay will effectively turn off. So let's have a quick listen to that. So we've created this kind of rolling echo that comes in for about an 1/8 note. I also like to assign the LFO slightly to the cutoff just to create a little bit of variation in the filter and then set that at a very low rate. The rates of the LFOs are actually tempo synced, so they'll always roughly sync to the tempo of your host track. So there we can hear the cutoff changing, but only for the voices that are actually going through the master effects. So the next thing I want to show you is probably one of the most interesting features when using sequence mode, which is that for each of the voices, you can set the pattern length individually. So in its default state, every voice is using 8 steps in the sequencer, but I can right click and then set some of the voices to just be 6 steps. You can set any voice to any number of steps you want between 1 and 8. So having set some of the voices to 6 steps, let's listen back to that and hear how it sounds. So there we can hear that the pattern has become a lot more complex and a lot longer than 8 steps, even though we've only been editing 8 steps in the sequencer. We can do the same in the modulation sequencer, right click and then set the pattern length. So our modulation can actually become a lot more complex, even though we're still only playing with 8 steps. Next, we're going to look at the contents of this second screen. So first we have the matrix tab, which shows us the modulation matrix. In the modulation matrix, we can take the output of any of the 8 voices and route it into the input of any of the 8 voices. And that can either be sent to the frequency modulation input or the hard sync input. So the same inputs as the feedback tab that we looked at earlier. So in this case, we could take the third voice, route it into the second voice by activating this square, or take the third voice and route it into itself by activating this square. You can route anything anywhere and you can actually produce very complex feedback paths and stuff. One of the things I should mention about the matrix tab is that this modulation routing happens before the mixer. So if I turn everything down except the lowest voice and then set the lowest voice to trigger on every step, if I create this setting in the matrix, every voice is being routed into the first voice. So here voices 2 through 8 are going into voice 1. Now we're only hearing voice 1. So if we listen to that back, we will hear the modulation being applied even though we're not hearing the outputs of the other voices. So I'm going to turn that off for now so that we can further demonstrate the other features. In the Bits tab, we have the Bit Designer. And what the Bit Designer allows you to do is alter the data stream for each of the voices. So each of the voices is coming in here through the y-axis, and then each of the steps in the x-axis represents one of the bits in the 8-bit digital stream, going from the most significant bits on the left to the least significant bits on the right. So the Bit Designer kind of in practice sounds like somewhere between a bit crusher and a wave shaper. It runs in two modes. There's deactivate mode. So when you flag a bit, it always sets it to 0. And then there's invert mode, which takes the input bit and then flips it. So if it's a 0, it becomes a 1. And if it's a 1, it becomes a 0. In practical terms, how this sounds is that deactivate mode is a little bit more gentle than invert mode. So let's have a play around and see how that sounds. So there we've created a fairly complex and evolving sound, even though we've only used 8 steps in the grid sequencer and just played around with a couple of knobs. I mean, in essence, we've just got a couple of sine waves, 2 effects, and a little bit of modulation. It's not really that much when you consider all of the parameters that maybe some other instruments would use to get similar results. Next, we're going to look at one of the snapshots that comes in the factory content, because it's actually quite a good place to learn how to use all of these features to create something that's quite familiar. So I'm going to go into the sequence drums and percussion bank and load Easy Beat 2. For the purposes of this walkthrough, I'm going to deactivate the pattern sequencer, which I'll talk about later when I reactivate it. So in this case, we can see that there's a sequence set up. We're in sequence mode, and that there's some matrix modulation going on, and there's some settings in the bits area. But let's first listen to it, and then I'll dissect the snapshot and tell you a little bit more about how I've created this sound. So when we listen to the sequence and watch the grid sequencer, we can see that we have a kick drum on this lowest voice. These middle voices are being used as a kind of snare, and then these highest voices are triggering a kind of hi-hat sound. Most of this is coming from the matrix, and there's a lot of feedback going on. So here you can see that voices 5 and 6 are being routed into voice 2, and then that voice 2 is being routed back into 5 and 6. So that's already feeding back. 5 and 6 are being routed into each other, and then these top voices are being routed into each other as well. And the highest voice is being routed into itself. So there's a lot of feedback going on in the matrix. In practice then, this makes the snare and the hi-hat sounds a lot more noisy because there's so much modulation and feedback going on. If we look at the mixer, we can see that the lowest voice and the highest voice are bypassing the master effects and coming through clean. So that's the lowest voice, which is our kick, and the highest voice, which is our hi-hat. We can also see that voice 7 and voice 2 are turned all the way down, even though they're being triggered, because they're being used in the modulation matrix to modulate the other sounds, to create complexity there for the hi-hats and the snare. When we look at the mod sequence, we can see that we have this kind of gate effect going on in mod sequence 1, and then if we look at where it's being routed to the decay time. So the modulation is increasing the decay time whenever the snare is being hit. So this makes the snare have a longer decay and everything else have a relatively short decay. When we look at the master effects and the mixer in tandem, we can see that it's only the snare that's going through the master effects. And there's a bit of a filter going on with a bit of an envelope, which kind of adds shape to the snare sound. And there's a little bit of a short delay going on. And the delay is kind of being used as a pseudo reverb, like a cheap reverb. In the output section, the dry is turned up higher than the wet, so that makes our kick nice and loud and pulls down our snare a little bit. It's a very easy way of mixing sort of 2 separate sounds where you can say, oh, it's kick and hi-hat and snare in this knob. So we don't have to use the mixer all the time for mixing these separate sounds. So now that we've looked at how the sounds are generated, I'm going to talk briefly about the pattern sequencer, which is also used in this snapshot. In Grid 2, you have access to 4 patterns. which store the settings of the grid sequencer and the 2 modulation sequences. When the pattern sequencer is deactivated, the pattern that you're viewing is the pattern that plays back, and you can select a pattern to view just by clicking on the pattern. When you activate the pattern sequencer, the patterns will play through one after the other and cycle around as long as the clock plays. So in this case, when I play back, we'll hear the first pattern followed by the second, followed by the third, and so on. Again, like in the grid sequencer and the modulation sequences, if we right-click here, we can set the length of the pattern sequencer. So here it'll only cycle through the first 2 patterns, here it'll cycle through the first 3 patterns, and then here through all 4. With the pattern sequencer active, you can see that pattern 1 is filled in and pattern 3 is highlighted. What this means is that we are viewing pattern 1, but pattern 3 is the pattern that's currently playing back. If I bring the transport to the start, there we have pattern 1 selected and playing back. And now we'll play back and watch how this changes as the sequence plays. So that's how the pattern sequencer works. It allows you to create more complex patterns than allowed by just the 8 steps there, but without having to rely on changing the step length per voice where you're not in complete control over the sequence. In this case, because we're creating a drum beat, we want to have that control. Lastly, I'm just going to quickly talk about played mode. Played mode itself has 2 modes of operation. You've got AutoCycle, which when active, every time you press a MIDI note, you'll move to another step in the sequence. And when it's deactivated, you select the steps using key switches. So we're going to load up one of the played sounds and show that in practice. We're going to load up Digi-EP. By default, Digi-EP has AutoCycle active. So I'm going to quickly play a C major scale, and then you can watch as the steps progress as I play each note. If I deactivate AutoCycle and play a C major scale, you'll see that we are stuck on 1 step with each note that I play. You can basically create a different sound on each step and then use key switches to move through these sounds. So that wraps up this part of the walkthrough. Next, I'm going to look at a host project and show you how different instances of grid have been set up to produce different sounds in a track. So here I have the project for the audio demo called 7th Dimension. It uses 7 instances of Grid 2 to produce all of the sounds. The first sound we hear in the track is the sequence synth. If we open it up, we can see it's using a variation of the snapshot called Please Seek Me. This snapshot uses a bit of modulation and played mode with AutoCycle active to produce a sound that changes with each new note that's played. So let's listen back to how that sounds. The next sound that comes in is the bass. If we open up the patch, we can see that we're using a variation on the mono bass snapshot, which is trying to emulate a kind of analog bass sound. The patch is running in sequence mode at straight 16ths. If we look back at the track, we can see a lot of automation going on. The main automation is being used to start and stop the sequence by automating the play button. Let's listen back to how this one sounds. The next instance that comes in are the drums. Here we can see the same automation on the play button. If we open the instance, you can see that it's using a variation on the Easy Beat snapshot, which we looked at earlier on in the video. It's using the same principles. Here we can see the first voice is the kick, the middle voices are the snare, and the top voices are the hi-hat. So let's have a quick listen to that in the mix. You'll hear there's a little bit of external reverb on the snare sound, but otherwise it's more or less unprocessed. The next instance that comes in is our lead synth. If we open up the patch, we can see it's a variation on the soft sometimes snapshot. In this instance, the grid is being used to create subtle variations of each note to emulate the inconsistencies of an analog device. The next instance we hear is the glitch harp. If we open it up, we can see that all of the voices are modulating voice 1. Voice 1 is the only voice that we're hearing. The modulation is being applied to the FM and the hard sync, so that's creating quite a complex sound already. And then there's feedback going in, so the whole sound is being fed back on itself, creating something even more complex and thus glitchy. We're in played mode with AutoCycle active, and if we actually look at the MIDI track in Sonar, we can see that it's using the arpeggiator. So even though we're running at a straight rate and we could have used sequence mode, I'm using the arpeggiator in this case because I wanted to be able to change the pitch quickly without having to automate the pitch of the instrument. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. In this next section, 2 new instances start up. The first one is a second layer for the lead synth. It's basically a variation on the same sound, but with a higher cutoff, so it's a brighter sound. The second instance is the fast hats. If we open that up, it's a variation on the chippy hat snapshot, but I've put it into sequence mode rather than played mode. There's a lot of modulation going on in the modulation matrix, and there's also a lot of feedback going into the FM. So that produces the very noisy sound that we always need for hi-hats. So let's listen back to this penultimate section. The final section of the track is pretty much just the glitch harp on its own, and the sound of the instrument morphs from something tonal to something completely noisy and back again. What's interesting about this section though is that the only automation going on is of the attack and decay in the amplitude envelope. So we're going to listen back to this section, keep your eyes on the attack and decay and on the grid matrix, and then we'll talk about how this is influencing the sound. So as the decay turns up, the voices all sustain for a lot longer, and because all of the voices are modulating voice 1, they all start to modulate at once and overlap on top of each other, and we get a very complex sound, which very quickly becomes unstable and turns into noise. As we dial the decay back, then we come back to something a bit more controlled. The attack is being used to just remove that initial transient, so as it turns up, we go from something percussive to something a bit more drone-like and ambient. So when both the attack and decay are up, we basically have a steady noise sound. And then as we bring them back down, we go to the initial glitch harp that we used at the start. And that brings us to the end of the walkthrough. If you already own Grid 2, I hope this has been informative and has inspired you to create your own sounds and snapshots. If you don't yet own Grid 2, I hope this video will inform your decision about whether or not this is the right instrument for you. In either case, I hope you enjoyed the video. And that was Grid 2, available now from Heavyocity.com.